Well, welcome everybody to today's webinar. It's great to have you join us for the next in our series on transition and well-being. And today it's an area that we're going to explore of impact of service and transition that is not necessarily leads people to a good place. And we're going to be exploring veterans in the justice system as the theme of this week's presentation, and also next week's presentation from Scotland. And so I hope that you will find this interesting and useful as you think about your aspect of work with veterans and their families. And also, I would suggest public safety officers and their families, because some of this impacts them as well. And it's my great pleasure today to welcome our two co-presenters, Kellie Toole and Elaine Waddell. Kellie and Elaine, their full bios are in the information pack that you will have received with the invitations to participate today. Kellie is a lecturer in the law school at Adelaide University, and she teaches criminal law. And prior to joining the university, she practiced as a criminal defence lawyer. So she comes from that particular background. And she has a research interest across the criminal law domain and human rights. And so she's got a very good background in this area. And Elaine is a researcher at Flinders University in their School of Medicine, Public Health, and she operates at the Jamie Larkham Veterans Mental Health Precinct. And Elaine has a social work background, and she's worked with the Australian veteran community for over 30 years in mental health policy, service delivery, and research roles. And today they're going to share with us their work with the South Australian Corrections on looking at veterans in the South Australian prison system. So it's my great pleasure to invite Kellie and Elaine to share with us this morning.
Thanks so much for the introduction, Robert. And Elaine and I are not co-located because of coronavirus restrictions, so bear with us if we're a little bit disjointed in the presentation, but we wanted to be very informal today, and happy to take questions throughout. And also for people who are listening to a recorded version online, we're really keen to make connections anywhere in the world, so do feel free to reach out after the session. Via email is probably the best, so kelly.toole@adelaide.edu.au. And Elaine, did you want to?
Yes, elaine.waddell@flinders.edu.au.
Yeah, so we'd certainly be really happy to hear from anybody during the presentation or after. So Elaine and I came together completely randomly in a social setting some years ago, actually, and found that we had this common interest, and it was through talking to one another that our different but complementary backgrounds came together. And I work as part of a research unit in military law and ethics within the Adelaide Law School. And so our two interests kind of coalesced, and we embarked on this project to look at veterans in the South Australian prison system. And perhaps Elaine, you want to talk to the background?
Yes, well, the study really came about because of the increased reporting we had seen in the media, as well as concern by veteran groups, particularly ex-service organisations, that they were seeing an increasing number of former serving members ending up in the criminal justice system. There was really anecdotal evidence at that stage. And in Australia, we have a predominantly state-based approach to criminal justice, so there's no uniform system for collecting data to even work out how many former serving members could be in prison. There's also very little research and policy initiatives happening in this area. I worked for the Government Department of Veterans Affairs until about 5 years ago. And it came up in discussion every now and then, but it was very much seen as, oh, that is a state responsibility. It's not a federal responsibility. So that was where we were coming from at the time of beginning the study, and that was the general thinking. We were very aware of the research being done overseas, particularly in the UK and Canada, and of course in the USA, because the USA has done research for quite a long time now in this area. Because of the increase in numbers that people were seeing with ex-serving members ending up in the criminal justice system after after Afghanistan, particularly around the time of the drawdown. And historically, this number seems to spike after major conflicts. There have been spikes in numbers of ex-serving members offending post-World War I, post-World War II, and we know once again, anecdotally in this country, post-Vietnam. And we know that the difficulties facing former serving personnel, such as post-traumatic stress disorder, suicide ideation, suicidality, homelessness, are also all known risk factors for incarceration. And there's quite a wealth of literature on these criminogenic factors. What we also looked at was that research undertaken overseas highlighted the shared characteristics in their populations of incarcerated former serving members. And several research studies reported that ex-serving members or veterans, we might just use the word veterans, it's easier, are reported to represent the largest known occupational group in prison. They're predominantly male and predominantly incarcerated for violent and sexual crimes. And given this common profile across allied countries, we then assume that the Australian profile could be similar. Kellie, I don't know if you want to add more.
Just to say, from a criminal law perspective, there's been a lot of Senate inquiries and parliamentary inquiries and other reports about transition with veterans, and the things that kept coming up were homelessness, substance abuse, mental health issues, relationship breakdowns. As a criminal lawyer, I'm so familiar with them as crimogenic factors, and I was thinking, so where is the criminal aspect of this? These guys have to be at risk of criminal offending as well, and yet it wasn't getting any attention when it seemed so obviously raised on the other factors that were being identified. So that was how we moved into the South Australian setting. So we set out to explore and gain an understanding of the pathways from offending from the perspective of the sentenced prisoner. So we wanted to talk to people who were actually having the lived experience of having transitioned from the military into the criminal justice system of serious enough offences that they ended up in prison, mostly in South Australia. And so our sample was male prisoners or ex-prisoners. Mostly the people we've spoken to are still currently in prison, but we're open to talking to people who've been released within the last 10 years. And we've spoken to only one person who's been on parole at this stage, as long as they've served in the ADF. And the way we've gone about it is undertaking structured audio recorded interviews with them in prison, fairly unstructured, so that we can get really their perspectives and that the discussion can free form in a way that really allows them to express their perspectives on things. So we're not overly determining what we ask them about. And Elaine sort of hinted about the scope of this issue, and certainly coming to it from somebody who didn't have a military background, I was astonished at the number of people who have been serving in the Australian military over the last couple of decades. Estimated 80,000 people have been deployed in the last 25 years, and they're taking longer and more frequent periods of service. And so the transition issues that Elaine referred to are being amplified simply by the numbers. And the most recent figures that have been collected have been from 2016, when there were nearly 59,000 members of the ADF who were in the operational deployment cycle, so either leaving the military or about to leave the military. So looking at those factors that would make them at risk of a number of social psychological and criminological issues, it is a very large pool of people that we were talking about. So the potential for this to resonate through the community, both within the ADF community and the broader community, was quite profound and a lot more extensive than members of the community would have expected. I'll just pause, Elaine, at the end of each slide in case you want to say anything. So
yeah, that's fine. It is a bit weird doing it this way.
It is a bit weird. So what's been getting a lot of attention in Australia is the suicide rates, and that's not something that we are looking at specifically ourselves, but it is really the most extreme pointer of the kind of issues that people have in transition. And the numbers of suicides, in the community generally is a huge national concern in Australia, but focusing just on the ADF personnel, the rate for suicide of men still serving in the military was a lot lower than it is in the general community, but it was 18% higher in the general community for men who had left the military. So that really speaks most starkly for the kind of issues that people are confronting. So we use that as a pointer to the seriousness of the transition issues rather than factoring suicide into our inquiry as it's in itself. We're speaking mostly about men, and we'll speak a little bit about women in a little bit more. It's not that we're excluding them from the study. It's just that because they're serving and offending at much less numbers and rates than men, we don't actually have the data. But the limited data that is available for suicide rates for women who've served in the ADF also indicates that they have a higher than general population suicide rate, and that is something that certainly needs more attention over time as well. So we really started our inquiry with two questions, which was, are veterans in South Australia overrepresented, and if so, why? We actually have been working really closely with Chris Tilley, who works for the Department of Corrections, who's ex-Army himself and has done an enormous amount of work within his job as a custodial and recreational officer within the Department of Corrections in South Australia to work with veterans communities, to encourage or give people the opportunity to identify as ex-service and to have support groups and connect them to external services. He has just been an amazing resource for us and supporter of veterans in the community. And late in 2018, he undertook a project within corrections to actually speak to every prisoner in South Australia, to speak personally with them to identify who had served in the military. So South Australia is quite a useful kind of microcosm for this, because we do have relatively small numbers of people in prisons. So there's plenty of jurisdictions where it would be completely impossible to speak to every prisoner in the state. We only had about 3,000 people. It was still a massive task, and amazing that he did it. And he spoke to everybody except those who were in hospital lockdown or in mental health lockdown. So, and then Chris has done an extrapolation of those results. He didn't find any women in that inquiry who had served in the military and were in prison. He did go to the women's prison, but he did find 93 veterans in the male prisons. And he has done some statistical analysis of that and identified that within certain range of statistics. An estimate is that the veterans are overrepresented by about double as the general population. So for our purposes, having the if question answered was hugely helpful. And so then we've been able to accept the statistics and say they are overrepresented and looking at why. In one sense, the overrepresentation is not the key for us, because we want to understand that pathway anyway. But the fact that there is an indication that they are overrepresented, which is really consistent with the anecdotal material that has been collected by service organisations, it just underlines the importance of actually looking at this inquiry and trying to find the connection.
I think it's also worth saying that prior to Chris doing this exercise with corrections, we had worked out how big our sample size could possibly be by using the Canadian statistic. I think it was around 2.83%. Looking at the fact that the Canadian Defence Force was of, comparable but slightly bigger size than the ADF at the time, and we came up with a figure of around about 75, 78, and that was it was really a guesstimate, and we were using that for purposes of saying, well, if we have this population fall in South Australia, then we should have enough potential participants to be able to do qualitative research with, to do face-to-face interviews with.
And that reference to Canada, it underscores the fact that we're not looking at anything necessarily unique in South Australia. We've got the unique opportunity to get into the prisons here and talk to them, but we're talking about this as a pilot for a much more universal kind of issue than something which is unique to South Australia. My expectation, we'd really like to look in some of the other states as well, particularly New South Wales. Our expectation is that we'll find that there's nothing unique about South Australia. So we're clearly not the first people to think about the connection between military service and criminal offending. It does come up in the American context, mostly in response to catastrophic kind of criminal offending, particularly the mass shootings which periodically occur in the US. After a mass shooting in California in 2018, President Trump was subject to quite a bit of criticism for the way he spoke about the occurrence and the connection that he made. He gave the impression that there was something inevitable about criminal offending resulting from military service, and he presented a very linear kind of view of what happens. So someone joins the military, everything's fine. They go to experience military service, particularly on active deployment. They experience trauma, and they come back with a new set of risk factors, which means that they're vulnerable to criminal offending. There's been subsequent research on that which suggests it's actually more complex than that, and that linear kind of explanation is really not helpful. Nobody is disputing that people will go to a war zone and come back changed in the responses to President Trump on this occasion. But the idea that everybody is broken and everybody is vulnerable to criminal offending has been really, really rejected. And certainly we are not trying to say that there is a connection which is going to affect everybody. We accept the attractiveness of this linear explanation. It is really neat, and it's not an irrational kind of presentation to be making, that everything's fine, trauma results in the military, and that is going to lead to the criminal offending. It's just that it doesn't seem to be true. And this research from Leanne Simpson, which was written up in The Conversation in the UK a couple of years ago, indicates that it's actually much more complex kind of connection, that it is not necessarily useful to focus only on the connection between military service and experiences and criminal offending. And there's a lot more complex factors that are involved pre, during and post-military service, which can create the vulnerabilities which mean that people might be vulnerable to criminal offending. And this is certainly the approach that we have been taking. And so the challenge for us is to have a nuanced enough approach that we're not taking a kind of Trumpian single approach and analysis, but also to be able to make sufficient generalisations that there can be some helpful insight. So that's where looking at the individual cases of people, getting as much of their individual life story is really important, and not trying to say that there's a single trajectory or a single reason, but trying to look at people's broad life experiences, their broad experiences in and outside of the military. Are there common themes that we can actually draw from those diverse life experiences, which allows us to create a nuanced and complex picture of where these intersections might be?
Perhaps we might just throw in here, because we're talking about our method and what we covered, that we did interview together Some of those issues, obviously, safety reasons, interviewing people in prison, but also we were able to bring both our perspectives into the interview, and we picked up very quickly that Kellie would delve down some of the legal questions and explore some of the more legal stuff that happened, and I would take a more social work approach. And these two perspectives then really helped us when we did the thematic analysis of the interviews once they had been transcribed. The other thing that probably is worth saying at this stage is that recruitment, when you're not working in corrections, in the prison system itself, is actually extremely difficult. And because of that, our study is taking a long time, and we do have the freedom to be able to do these interviews over a long period of time.
I absolutely confirm what Elaine said, and I think so often the prison we go to most frequently is quite a long way out of Adelaide, so we have a long drive each way there, and we'll so frequently come out and say to the other, that was a fantastic question that you asked in there, and we'll look at each other and go, well, that was an obvious question. Well, of course you would have asked that. But from our perspective, things that are so obvious, they're not from the other perspective. So the criminal and the public health social work has been really useful. And I think to have done it from a purely criminal point of view would have lost not 50%, but more like 80 to 90% of the richness of what we're finding, I think.
And ditto the other way around.
It's been a great collaboration. So we are really dependent on corrections to let us in, and essentially we're dependent on Chris Tilley really to let us in. We've got approval to go to the prisons, but without his initiative and contacts, we haven't had any contacts that have not involved Chris. So that has been entirely dependent on him identifying a veteran, being able to arrange an appointment, and us getting to go and see them. And the interviews are relatively unstructured, but we really can take a whole life cycle approach. So we talk about their childhood, why they joined the military, what it was like in the military, what it was like leaving the military, and then about their criminal offending patterns, both during and after the military, although the offending is not exclusively, but very heavily after the offending rather than during. We talk about the military, and we have an interest in all the branches of service, but Army is absolutely predominant in the interviews that we're doing. Of the 14, only one has not been in Army or Army Reserve, and that was someone who was in the RAF Reserve, the Air Force. This is consistent with what we're finding with the international research, that Army infantry is really the dominant representation. All of them joined in their early 20s. They served a median term of 5 years, and 5 of the 14 were actively deployed, and all of those had a more, at least 5 years service. 4 were medically discharged and the others voluntarily. The differences of the experience of those medically and voluntarily discharged, the differences are not as great as they might appear on the surface, and we'll talk about that. 5 were first offenders. So when we talk about this research to anybody from a criminal law background or criminology background, they're always surprised by that, because they always assume that we're talking about a group who would have had fairly extensive criminal history in their youth. A lot of them spoke about getting into a bit of trouble, a bit of violence, but this was not a pool of people who had a significant criminal history prior to actually leaving the military service. And the range of offences that have been covered are really broad, not inconsistent with what Elaine was saying earlier about the international research suggesting that violence and sex offences were the strongest reasons people were imprisoned. That has certainly come up, but drug offences, firearm offences, property damage, and a serious, causing very serious injury through dangerous driving. So the range of offences, they're all serious to end up in prison, but they are of a varied nature. There's other things that we want to explore that we're not going to talk about today. But the issue of women and the military connection is really important, very under-researched simply because of the lack of numbers. We did have the opportunity to go to the women's prison with Chris, because what he identified on the first occasion where he did the original audit was that women voluntarily came up to him and said, I haven't served in the military, but my dad did, or my mum did, or my husband did. And they said to Chris in that initial contact, that absolutely had a role in my offending. So we've been to the women's prison once, and we spoke to 3 people on that occasion, and that was one who had a husband in the military and other 2 who had parents in the military. And so we've had detailed interviews with them, and they spoke really articulately about what that connection was, and the growing up or living in an adult household with someone who has military experience and the impact that that has. We'd love to have more interviews of that nature, but I think in the future we might even be able to do something with as a case study with those 3, because some of that was quite profound. Substance abuse keeps coming up, and we'll talk to that in passing, but that is really something which is a significant topic in itself. The military justice system as well, and what people had experience of before they left the military in terms of justice is important. And the attitudes to fitness and resilience, I think that has a really strong impact on particularly the willingness to seek help when issues start to be going problematic after service, and their relationships with their own children. We talk about their relationships with their father, which are not good, and the relationships with their own children are something we'll explore later, and they are equally as poor as they are with their own fathers. So there is a cycle of family relationships which is being played out in a very sad way. So this is our challenge, is to find the more nuanced pathway. And rather than everything's okay, you go into the military, you experience trauma and come out at risk of criminal offending, we've come up with a scheme which I've shown it to some criminal lawyers who say, well, that's exactly the same mapping that you would do with anybody who's in prison. And a lot of that is true. We're talking about difficult childhoods, especially relationships with father, difficulties with employment and social connection. That is certainly something common. What characterised the people that we spoke to was that there was something in their childhood that they held out the military. It was either through people they knew, movies they'd seen. There was something about the military that they thought, there's something really positive about the military. And they thought, if I can join, I will find what I don't have now. I'll get discipline, I'll get respect, I'll stay out of trouble. And what we found that was their expectations were generally met, and some of the way that the men talked about the military was absolutely glowing and appreciative. Where things went bad for them was in the discharge, and irrespective of whether they chose to leave or whether they were forced to leave for medical reasons, and they were the only 2 categories of discharge that we had, they experienced this sudden and complete loss of everything that had been keeping their life together, of everything for many of them they'd been imagining since childhood and dreaming of since childhood. They lost it completely. And so the childhood issues that they had then exacerbated and created the risk of criminal offending. But we're not saying it's the military caused it, it's the childhood that caused it. We're saying it's the interaction of those 2 things which have created a kind of perfect storm, which means this particular pool, when we've spoken to at other groups where there've been military people and they've said, hang on, lots of people transition and don't have these problems. We're not disputing that at all. We know that we're talking about a particular subset of people in the military who have this particular background that manifests in this particular way. It's certainly not representative of everybody or necessarily most people in the military, but it's a really important subset, and we owe it to them and the community to understand that a bit more. So to break down the nuanced pathway to offending, we're going to go through our findings in relation to childhood, previous exposure to ADF or ADF members, reasons for joining, how that met the expectations, and their transition from military to civilian life. And going through the interviews and analysing the transcripts that we had transcribed, these are the key things that were the key kind of life points. And the mental health issues, which Elaine will talk about, that underlie their experience from well before they joined the military. So the theme of childhood, there was only, of the 14 we spoke to, one of those 14 who was raised by both parents in a home where there was no violence. There was a lot of unhappiness in the childhoods of the other people we spoke to. And some of that was outside the immediate family and constituted bullying at school or sexual abuse within a school or extended family setting. The relationships within the immediate family were of particular interest to us as a social worker and a criminal defence lawyer. We're looking to go back to those source issues. So 3 out of 14 with a physically abusive father, 2 with a physically abusive stepfather, 2 with emotionally abusive father, and 4 with absent fathers. And whether that's estranged after marriage breakup, 1 after a mother died, and 1 through foster care and only met his father at the age of 10. So this relationship with the father, or lack of relationship with the father, it's something that we had a particular interest in from our backgrounds, but it was not something that we went out of our way to elicit from the interviews. In fact, it wasn't something that I even thought of to ask in the question. But when we talked about background, this came up time and time again. Mm-hmm. And then there were other issues of trauma that were related to some of this. You know, 1 experienced the death of 2 young brothers, and he talked about that frequently. Death of a mother, trauma of multiple foster homes and the trauma that's attendant upon that, and 1 was homeless as a young person. Others had parents with mental health and substance abuse. So there was that kind of background of dysfunction. And another thing that we really didn't think of going in that became really important was the number who had family members in the ADF, and only 2 that we spoke to didn't have any connection. And I won't read it out because it's right there, but that having a father, stepfather, foster father or mother, sisters or grandfathers, there is a really strong sense of military, especially among a male cohort, that's a positive thing to do. And even where people didn't have relatives in the military, there was that aspect of law enforcement through fire and police and corrections. So that first responder authority was a really strong theme coming through.
I think probably just another point is that none of the participants reported any support or assistance for the issues they were experiencing as children when they were children.
Yes, that was really profoundly apparent. So when they talked about their fathers, and this is something that came up fairly frequently, and these are obviously not the people's real names, but so there were young men and boys who had the responsibility for caring for fathers when they had alcohol problems, and that disrupted their own childhood because their fathers were not being able to function through addiction, and it's left with such resentment that Andrew says that he wouldn't even care if his dad died tomorrow. Bernie, who we spoke to, he's the one whose brothers died when they were toddlers, and in the course of an hour and a half, whatever we were with him, I think he told us this story 3 times, that his father said that we'd be better off as friends than father and son, and that was just a profoundly defining moment for him. Jamie remembered that the enormous violence that he experienced from his father, and just being picked up and thrown against a wall as a small boy, and then the fear that he experienced when his mum was experiencing domestic violence. Another father of Nathan who had mental health issues, and so his childhood was managing those mental health issues. And Simon talked about only meeting his dad, and only by chance that he met him, and someone just sort of pointed to a man and said, "That's your dad," and he went over and said, "Are you my dad?" And that was the first contact he'd had with him, and he spoke very movingly about that. And rather than experiencing resentment about that, he seemed to be trying to find a positive slant and saying, "I know he loves me, but he doesn't know how to tell me." But that lack of the father figure came through really profoundly as being a lack in these men's lives when they were growing up. So then we turn to the reasons for joining, and these were clearly closely related to each other and to the childhood experiences and to the connections that people had with the military and their expectations of the military. So some of it was quite pro-social kind of areas of joining. They could see themselves not having a good future, not behaving in ways that were respectable and honourable, so that they could have a life that was more structured and more productive and positive. One just said he didn't have anything else to do. But the camaraderie and stability was very linked to that. There was also a theme of young men liking guns and liking the idea of war, and the military providing an option into that. So the seeking respect, and this is what we would kind of put in a fairly pro-social category. You have that feeling of not going anywhere and wanting to be something in your life, and the military holding that possibility out. There's also the kind of reversing the negative trends, so that life was going to shit. And if you knew that you had the discipline, you were really yearning for that because you could see yourself heading down a bad track. Some were quite honest about the kind of antisocial behaviour they engaged in, and just randomly attacking people, and realising that that was no good, and that you needed to make a positive change as a young man. And Gordon's was interesting because he remembers as a child being pulled over and police finding weapons in the back of the family car, and his father pulling out his army ID, and the police officer saying, "Oh, I'm very sorry, sir, you go away." This really imprinted on Gordon's mind that there was something about the military that gave you this protection. And I look at that on the face of it, and if I was coming from the outside and hadn't met Gordon, I think I'd be looking at him thinking that the military gave you a free pass to engage in illegal behaviour. It didn't come over at that time as that way. It was more about the respect that it engendered rather than the opportunity of actually getting away with antisocial behaviour. But that doesn't come through on the papers, but it certainly came through in talking to Gordon.
I think what we also found was that the participants joined at fairly young ages, around about 18 seemed to be the average. And so they were making decisions at this young age to do something to change the course of their life trajectory. And that spoke of a degree of resilience as young people, particularly young people who'd come through incredible family dysfunction and trauma, and not really offended, as you would expect at a young age.
Agree. So the other theme that came through strongly was the camaraderie and stability, looking for a home, somewhere to bunker, and the social isolation that people experienced as young men. A number of these people were from the country as well, which might have a particular impact, and some of them were on property, so they were physically a bit isolated. But Nathan grew up in a city environment, and he'd never had any friends as a young person, never had any friends, and thought he could make one. And Carl's saying that the only friendship he'd ever had was with his horse. I mean, and that was as a young countryman, of course. And it was a profound kind of feeling, the isolation that these people had, and the lack of connection that they had both in the family and in the community. The less pro-social kind of attitudes that were apparent were expressed in this idea of the seeking guns and war. But even some of that, it sounds a bit counterintuitive, but not all of that came over as being a bit antisocial, wanting to commit violence or wanting to kill people. Some of it was just going back to memories, and Gordon actually goes on a really quite lovely reverie about growing up in the 70s and how simple things were, and how happy he was as a child. And part of that was getting a gun and going shooting and having the knowledge of gun. It was about fun. And in the bigger quote that we could have put in there, he talks about all sorts of things that were characteristic of growing up in the 70s. So for him, there was almost a naive innocence about his use of the guns, which wasn't actually particularly about violence. Simon's was a lot more amorphous. He couldn't actually link it to anything particular. He'd had a very unsettled childhood with a lot of foster parents. But he created that image of sitting and watching these World War II movies with his foster parents who had both served in the Air Force. And I think it was the connection with them and something about the bigger picture. And he couldn't really explain it. I can't even interpret it other than the fact that it was this connection with his foster parents. But he found it really moving to watch these planes, and that stayed in his mind from the time that he was actually a really little boy. And he converted that to a period in the Air Force Defence Force. Then there were the less pro-social kind of attitudes to violence. And there were some who said, I was an angry man and I wanted to kill people. And there was partly a thought that this is my way to do it, which is sanctioned, which is lawful, which has got some greater good. Others gave more of the impression that it was simply the opportunity to kill, and they didn't really need to frame it for themselves in the sense that there was any higher purpose. They were reasonably comfortable with saying, I just wanted to go to war, and Grant linked this directly to his father, who had military experience, and that he'd been programmed as a young person, and it was about the aggression, and it was about the outlet for that aggression that people were really struggling to find in civilian life. We've extrapolated some of these themes to pick out different bases, but the connection is much more profound because they're all interrelated, and Jamie expressed this the best, I thought, and he talked about stripping down a rifle and the routine that goes with that, and standing up for people that were being picked on. And he was someone who'd been bullied at boarding school, and it was almost like this chance to redeem what had happened to him, and he would become the one with the more power and stand up for other people who were vulnerable like he had been. There was aspects of love of country, sort of imposing some sort of justice. I mean, you're focusing the violence, but it's on the bad people. So it had that sort of moral element to it. And it was also about the controlled environment. It's also about respect for himself and respect for others, and a personal redemption within a social context that was related to potential for the war as well. So it really, in that sense, puts it in a very positive slant on something which, on its face, that idea of just wanting to go to war can look like an entirely antisocial trend, but it was packaged in a lot of complex factors. What the military did for people was really important. And I was somewhat surprised talking to them just how positive the bulk of people were about their time in the military. For me, when things had gone so off track for people after the military, my expectation would have been that it projected back negatively. It's that time had really sent me off the wrong course, but it was absolutely the opposite. And the way many of them spoke about their military experience was glowing. Carl, the best thing he ever did, the fact that he loved it, true friendships, working out the family issues. So there's an awareness in these guys that they weren't educated people, but they had an enormous amount of self-insight and were able to articulate things in a really profoundly moving and expressive way at times. So that family that he never had. There was something about the divisions within the military that did resonate for some people, that these guys wanted to go to war and didn't, and feeling a little bit lower self-esteem over that, a little bit like you were secondary because you didn't go to war. And this reflection of, I love the colour green and putting on the uniform and the respect that it showed. So they spoke, and some of these guys had left the military maybe 20 years ago, and there was certainly a strong sense of nostalgia for some of them, but their recollections were positive. And this theme about the fitness, this is why I'd like to explore that at some later stage, because the fitness came up over and over again. And that was a topic that I hadn't ever identified in advance as something that might be important. But that sense of being strong, in control, and I think that links back to that idea of the vulnerability that you had as a young person, to suddenly feel that you were so in control and so fit and so strong, as well as Simon articulated, if you've got things on your mind, that fitness to be able to focus on that and keep you from reflecting on your own issues. It had that purpose. But the fitness is a really important part of the resilience, I think. It wasn't all good though. What happened in the military, irrespective really of whether people deployed or not, the military could achieve some trauma. Exactly the sorts of things that President Trump was talking about, that you can go to deploy. He didn't have any nuance to it, and he oversimplified and he overgeneralized, and he was offensive. But the reality was that people did talk about the trauma that they'd experienced, and that made things worse, particularly when they'd been in deployment. Often the theme of children arose, and what they'd seen happen to children, or the experiences that children have, really left them with that feeling of powerlessness and why can't we help more? And just the physical, and psychological shock that's associated with what they're seeing, people being stoned and bodies left in the compound. And that clearly did have an impact on people. There was also this situation of institutional betrayal, and this relates to the fact that these guys had this great belief in the military and what it could do. They generally really believed strongly in the mission of the military and wanted to be part of it. And when they felt like that had let them down, that was another blow on top of the childhood issues and on top of the trauma that they experienced. And Nathan talked, he was probably the one who had the most negative view of the military that we spoke to, and he felt absolutely cheated about the deployment, that they were told that it was going to be a bit of a cleanup, that it would be not a terrible experience, and they went there and they were actually facing a lot of attack and a lot of active fire that he wasn't expecting. And he said it shook his faith in the military. Then his legal issues became very complex, and it's shaken his faith in the criminal justice system, to the extent that he doesn't want to be part of the country, he won't support the country, and it's only his family. He was unique in that he had a very supportive family and some contact with at least one of his children. But for him, family was all that was left as something to believe in. Country and military, he had no fondness or respect for it all in that regard. So we identified in some cases a direct connection between the ADF and offending. So in the case of the person who was convicted of manslaughter, having been charged with murder and arguing self-defence unsuccessfully, he was convicted of the lesser offence of manslaughter, but still spending a significant amount of time in prison. And this was a situation where the court did not accept that there was a self-defence argument, but that is his narrative on what happened on that night. And he was assailed, this is beyond dispute, that he was assailed by two people in his home, one a woman, over a false allegation that he was having an affair with somebody. And where, from a non-military background, you might say, if two people came at me, I would just be getting the hell out of there. He was saying that's not an option. Actually, removing yourself from a fight, it is just not possible. And he was somewhat intoxicated, as were they, so that affected judgment as well. But from a military perspective, it's so ingrained that you don't run away from a fight. You stay there, and it's a natural instinct, and to sort this out. And then so because he stayed and went to defend himself, and then in the end, through a scuffle, a woman very, very sadly lost her life. And he linked his reaction directly to what he experienced in the military through his training. The other thing, and I've recently been to New Zealand and talked to some people through corrections and Veterans Affairs over there, and that's clearly an issue in New Zealand. I think just from my initial conversations, perhaps more of an issue than we have in Australia, that the bikie gang is an attractive proposition because they provide at least the promise, and no one I've spoken to has ever said that bikie gangs actually deliver this, but they deliver the promise of a place to belong. That brotherhood that they had and missed in the military, someone that recognises their skills that they gained in the military, and someone who knows what they have to offer and can value them. And that is very attractive for people, especially ones who have skills that aren't particularly transferable. And Gordon spoke to us that he, in fact, when he was involved in bikie violence, he'd been known to call the police himself because he wanted to see people under pressure. He wanted to test that friendship because that came up time and time again. In the military, in the army particularly, that person beside you, they've got your back, you've got their back. Come hell or high water, you can trust them. And that sense that you never get that outside. You never, ever get it. The bikie gangs were the only things that held out the promise, and no one ever said that actually delivered. And this was one of the most poignant sort of passages that we've had from the interviews, I think, that Gordon has seen other people and they feel forgotten because they haven't been brought down. They haven't been given any transition. Bang, you're over. And if you think that it's working in civilian life, it's not working. It might be working for a minute, but that sense that you're changed because you've been in the military, you'll never be a regular civilian, but you're not in the military, so you're not part of that community either. You're in this kind of no man's land, and that comment, that value. Gordon is someone who left the military voluntarily because he met a woman and he thought that relationship would be ongoing, which it wasn't. And he worked in her family business making awnings. And that profound comment about he had all this power, he had all this respect, and suddenly he's sewing awnings in a factory. And this was just such a profound letdown for him that I thought that was a really interesting insight.
That changed thinking came through again and again. And, you know, comments such as, we need to be deprogrammed. You know, we come out of the military, but our thinking hasn't changed at all. It's so ingrained. And that is such a critical area to look at in transition.
And some have said, you took us in there and you trained us to kill, and then you sent us out on the street. Like, what did you think was going to happen? And there was some power in that. In relation to reoffending, so in terms of kind of getting people to desist from offending as their life goes on, and Gordon said, I couldn't. I went to jail when I was partly through a drug import session, and you don't leave a job undone. You get that job done. So as soon as he got out, he had to finish that off, and he ended up being caught up again and in prison again. But it was that sense of when you start something, you finish it. And he linked that directly back to his military experience at all. And some of the guys told some really quite funny stories about when they would go into a workplace, perhaps a factory, and they are going hell for leather. There's no stopping. And the other blokes are going, hang on a minute, mate, you're making the rest of us look bad. Just slow it down. And even in the workforce, that kind of attitude was present in a very pro-social way, except everybody around them was saying, stop it, mate. And so they had trouble settling in there. There's also the connection, and this was the hit and run situation, which caused very serious injury to another man. There's a connection where they're with the original offending because Nathan was very traumatised and he had a substance abuse problem and he was drinking when he drove. But then there was the connection between making an offence which would have been bad enough, making it worse, because as soon as he hit this person, he kept driving. And of course that makes it, in the civilian world, quite rightly, hit and run is reprehensible in the normal scheme of things. But he was saying that was his training. If you hit something in a war zone, you don't stop. You get to the nearest point, you go back to your base. And that's what he did. But in a civilian world, that was interpreted through a kind of civilian framework of somebody who's just running away and trying to avoid liability. So the indirect connection between military service and offending. And Bernie talked about it kept his mind occupied. He was always busy with something. And there's so many opportunities to volunteer for things, to do more. You can just keep working all the time and giving you those structure. You think you're working through your childhood issues. You're not working through them. You're keeping them under control. very related to the particular setting that you're in. When you take away all that structure and you take away that busyness, everything that you went in with, it's still there, and you weren't ready for it because you thought it was under control. And as Jamie said, it's fantastic when you're in it. It's tight and you're functioning, but the minute that you leave, it's like a ticking time bomb. And he's one who says, you're trained to shoot people, stab people. That's what you do. And he still talked about really, really loving that. And you put that person without support into a non-military setting, without, as Elaine was saying, adjusting their mental thinking or their opportunities, and you really do, like he says, have a ticking time bomb. So there were no positive reflections about transition from the military. That a lot of them were very highly trained, but the training didn't necessarily make sense in the civilian world or wasn't easily translatable. They had trouble securing references, partly because the officers and the non-officers were so distant from each other, and no follow-up. These guys said they didn't even know how to cook for themselves, so they were at sea there. More importantly, I think, is the sense of rejection. The military was so important to them. Their identity was so caught up in that. And then from the minute you leave, you're out. So sudden, you just walk away and there's no ties, nothing to bring people back in. And that medical discharge is perhaps the most profound form of that, because these guys would say, I would have been okay. Yes, my medical condition would mean I couldn't have done exactly what I was doing to start with, but if you'd given me some time, given me some support, I could have done something else in the army, but they weren't given that opportunity. So that sense of feeling undervalued was really kind of profound. Very similar when it was voluntary, because you still didn't have any warning. And even though the guys had chosen to leave, it was often for a relationship that didn't end up working out. And it wasn't really because they'd had enough. It was more that they were in a relationship with somebody who didn't want to be part of the military life. Transitioning to friendships was really difficult. These were guys, remember, who had trouble making friendships to start with. They then had this experience of this intense experience of friendships where people were just around you, that you knew you could trust. And you can't stay friends with people in the military because you're different to them, plus they move around so much. But it's hard to make friends with people outside, and there's that natural feeling that the people in the military thinking, oh, you're lucky you're free, and the ones who are out are thinking you're so lucky you're in. So there's a disconnect there. And you can't talk to the military people, Carl said. Your experiences are so different that there's just no way. And he's the one who felt particularly profoundly sort of secondary because he hadn't served. So that was now, not only had he not served, he wasn't even in the military. And Jacob was quite insightful about society outside the military is very individualistic. It's workforce and social life, very individualistic, completely different to that structure that you'd had in the military. And the identity and exclusion were particularly the more elusive kind of things, a little bit harder to put a specificity around, but it was really real. And they even said it was hard to explain. You want the discipline and you try and replicate it yourself in the outside world, but how can somebody without a job, without social connections, create a really disciplined structure for themselves? It's just, it doesn't make sense, and yet it's all you know, and you know it's a solution, but you can't replicate it. And Gordon's reflections, I think, he had travelled very widely and he'd seen people all over the world. And he spoke really passionately about, you're never going to be a civilian. You might pretend, but you never will, because you change forever. And yet that institution, which changed you in that profound way, doesn't do anything for you. And people are holding on to something, looking for a buoy, and there's nothing to stop them from drowning. And he related that directly back to the lack of support available in the military. So the last, and certainly perhaps we should be first because it's the most profound issue, is the mental health issue that Elaine's particularly passionate about.
Yeah, certainly every single participant we spoke to had at least one mental health issue. Some had been diagnosed, Some it was quite clear just from the interviews, and we spent on average an hour, sometimes more than an hour, with each of these participants. It was clear that some of them would meet the DSM criteria for mental health disorders. 9 of the men, including all those who've been deployed on combat or peacekeeping missions, have been diagnosed with post-traumatic stress. There were also diagnoses, the participants reported to us, of multiple personality disorder, antisocial personality disorder, bipolar, depression, panic disorder, suicidal attempts and ideation, schizophrenia, obsessive compulsive disorder, and obviously alcohol and other drug disorders. And these were all labels. And, you know, a lot of labels have been applied for people with very complex behaviours and thinking. And we thought that these factors were pretty critical to understanding the connection between military service and criminal offending in general. But in particular for the participants in this study, several had clearly experienced considerable childhood trauma, but had not received any therapeutic interventions prior to enlisting, or on discharge, and also while in the prison system. Some of the trauma that was described clearly related to the nature of the offences committed and experiences while in prison. So we have childhood trauma, traumatic exposures during time in the military, and then traumatic exposure due to the nature of the offence and you know, things that happen while you're in the prison system. Anger and alcohol featured heavily in offending, and 2 participants were current serving members at the time of offending, both first offences, and were under the influence of alcohol at the time. And if we just go on to treatment, next slide. Yeah, thanks. What really came out, and you know, some participants did talk about this, was that the specialised counselling services available through the Department of Veterans Affairs in Australia to all who've served in the military are not available to those in prison. And as I said before, most described, you know, any treatment while in prison as pretty well non-existent. And yet, while the government recognises that those who serve have unique experiences, and therefore, you know, specialised counselling services are put in place to support participants, you know, to support people who need mental health assistance. There's a complete neglect while you're in the prison system, and for us, we very strongly feel that this needs to be recognised, and that specialised services do need to be able to access the prison system and provide these services. I mean, these participants have served, you know, they've served their country. We also felt quite strongly that the ADF itself has a responsibility to, in a way, monitor the mental health state of those enlisting. You know, look at what are the issues, to understand these issues better, so that there's a better understanding of, if someone makes a decision to leave at the age of 25, and you know they've got a history of childhood abuse and trauma, you know, what services need to be put in place to help them then manage that transition better. Kellie, do you want to say anything else there?
No, and that's really sort of brings us to the end of our formal presentation. So hopefully we've just made the point that while there is evidence of some direct connection between the military and the transition is profoundly important, it's also at the point of entry that there needs to be some attention as well as to the issues that people have when they come in and how that's going to play out when they go through. And it's not really the dominant impression we gained was not that it was the direct connection between military service and offending that was the main issue. It was the indirect effects of the underlying problems, trauma experienced in the military, the suddenness and the unsupportedness of the transition creates this perfect storm where all the social factors that are affecting people and the psychological factors that are affecting people leave them vulnerable to offending, and that's where the support needs to be. So thank you for your interest and happy to take questions.
Well, thank you very much, Kellie and Elaine, for a very interesting overview. To those of you who are online, if you have questions, please click on or comments that you'd like to make, please click on the chat bubble at the bottom of your screen and type in your question or query, and we'll pass that to Kellie and Elaine and ask them to respond to your question. While we're waiting for some questions to come in, there were a couple of things that came out of that, and there seem to be repeating themes that we've heard from other presenters in looking at other aspects of this life and transition experience. And they relate to your observations around what happened prior to joining the military. And interestingly to me, it's across borders. It doesn't matter which country you're looking at, is that it's almost like the patterns, it's the repeating beat of the drum in a way. So I guess I'd like to start by saying, or asking a question. You talked about the fact that when people come into the military is that maybe the military and by virtue of Veterans Affairs agencies needing to be more cognizant of what's gone on before, plus what's gone on during, and then to use your comment, Elaine, about the fact that they've been programmed and then influencing the deprogramming. So from what you've seen with this group of veterans in the prison system, what are some of the things you think that might need to feed into a, whether we call it deprogramming or supportive transition process that would help people to deal with, as you pointed out, what had happened before, and then the experiences while they were in the military that allows them to move out and to establish themselves in life post-service that has a degree of stability and future and a base upon which they then can move forward in a constructive way.
Possibly access to increased psychological support, perhaps practical support as well around living skills, making comments based on not knowing what's currently happening within the ADF DVA transition space. So yeah, I should qualify that. But just from these interviews, certainly the access to support is critical.
The two other things I think that have come up is peer support, and that's something that has been used with some success in international jurisdictions, and we're very much guided by Chris Tilley's thinking in this as well, and he talks about this generally with prisoners as well as ex-military. You need people who've had the same lived experience. So if you've got somebody who you can set up an informal or formal mentoring kind of relationship with, so they've got someone to guide them through. And the other thing is some sort of ceremonial kind of continuation. And I've even got a colleague here who hasn't had any of these sort of transition problems, but she was in the Air Force. And she said on her final day, she sort of drove somewhere and picked up her papers and drove away. And that was kind of it. For an institution that's got so much ritual and so much ceremony, maybe you could have people go back. There was a quote, I can't remember if we had it in this slide, but someone said he used to go back and beg to mow the lawns for free and they wouldn't let him. Is there some way that you can have some sort of ceremonial or practical connection? So not with people in the Defence Force, but they still feel that they're part of it, or they've got some recognition. So peer mentoring and some sort of ceremonial or at least symbolic connection, I think, would be really useful.
The peer mentoring certainly came out as particularly important in the prison system and as a way of preventing recidivism. But yes, as Kellie says, certainly beforehand is critical.
We've got a question here. Just lost it for a second, my apologies. The question is, do you believe the ADF has a duty of care to make sure transition includes dealing with and responding to and supporting people that they know have mental health conditions, PTS or ACE before release? And I guess by virtue does that include integrating them into support services as part of that, like developing, as you said, Kellie, like some sort of ceremony, but whether it's a ceremony but a process that recognises and maybe honours their service. So is that something that you think is important as well?
Extremely important. I think it had a duty of care to the men involved and women if they come up in this group. Also the rest of the community. I mean, we're very empathetic with these people. Some of their crimes have been terrible. And if you're having a group of people who are being released and are at known risk of other offending, duty of care to the community as well. If there's any group of people who are likely to be engaging in offending for whatever reason, that needs to be supported. And there was one person who spoke to, he was very insightful, and he was saying they know that they're taking people in who've got some issues, but they like that. They like that. They want somebody who's really not averse to risk, who's looking for adventure, who's got a bit of violence in them, that they like that. So if you actually knowing that on recruitment and then you know that they're going to be leaving, absolutely a duty of care to the people involved and to the rest of us.
Mm-hmm. Another question here is, says, what do you think can be front-footed by the ADF or any other country's military as these people from troubled backgrounds are wrapped around these people ahead of time, given, as you said, that there's a high level of probably being aware, unofficially, if not officially, that they've got these people. And then the second part of the question is, what observations, screenings and profiling could be done while people are still serving with a view to developing an end-of-service plan? And I think that goes back to, I can't remember, Kellie or Elaine, which of you said it, is sort of almost like an individual plan for people based around their context. And then the question goes on, and what sort of feedback is given to those in service based on the feedback you receive, so they can better understand this situation they're in, and making sure that people themselves, and you had an item there about self-help, actually know what they can do and where they can go to get the help that they need, so they don't fall through the cracks. So you got some comments about that?
No, sorry, just pausing. I thought that was more in Elaine's thing.
There were three.
Yeah.
Yeah, three questions. Sorry, you'll have to go over them again.
Oh, well, the first one is about, I'll break them down into the three separate questions.
That'd be useful.
This person has put them all in the one stream. So it's about where the military, depending on which country, it doesn't matter, are aware or reasonably should be expected to be aware that these people have come from troubled backgrounds. And so what do you think in that, actually we could wrap the two together. The next one was about screening for those things and developing an end of service plan, which goes back to that thing you were saying about traditions and some process for helping people to leave in a good way.
Well, that makes sense.
So what sorts of things could be done or need to be thought about there, Elaine?
Well, as we've already covered, things such as the access to psychological support, the access to peer support, and access to social support. But it is a matter of making sure that those services and supports are in place before someone is actually discharged. That's part of the transition.
I think even having some framework to be able to communicate in a civilian sense, what skills people have from the military, rather than people might have a stereotype, oh, they've just been trained to kill. Well, what about some of this? I mean, some of the people we spoke to had very technical skills in relation to communications and signalling, things that I've got to confess I don't really understand very well at all. But they struck me intuitively as having relevance to quite a few areas. Like if you could have some sort of translation so that when these guys go out, they can say, look, what I've done is this. This is how it makes sense in a military setting, but these are the generic skills that would be useful. And people spoke, the bikies get it. The bikies get that you can have somebody, and they're really good for house breaks, apparently, apart from the fact that they're really good for random acts of violence, because you can go, and one person spoke with, you can go in a house and you can tell who lives there, where there's been latest movement, all of these things which are really antisocial to be helping people undertake criminal trespass. There's skills in there that must be useful that somebody other than bikie gangs can kind of recognise, interpret and translate in a way that shows where their value is in other areas of the workplace.
We seem to be getting a few questions and comments, so we might move on. We've got one comment here. Thank you for a great presentation. I'm interested in the military justice system, which you mentioned as another potential topic for investigation. And the question is, could you expand a little more on how the interview data prompted that observation?
It probably didn't, because I have a separate life in within academia, in working with military lawyers and working with them, and I teach a component on the military justice. So the interest has probably come from there rather than from the interviews, because the interviewees had very little connection with the military justice system. Almost no infringements, no nothing. Some of them were stretching to say, oh, once I was AWOL once because I was late back, and really, really trivial. So it might not actually be a hugely rich area, and it's come from another place rather than actually the interviews, because these guys were generally very good and compliant soldiers. They were not committing a lot of offences. Mouthy at times, but not really disciplinary, and whatever they did do wrong tended to be so minor that it was in the summary justice rather than the higher level military justice. I have a general interest in, if you've got serious crimes, should they be heard in a military tribunal, should they go to a civilian system, which I think are interesting, but they tended not to be caught up by these guys.
Thanks for that. Another comment and question. The comment is, there's a stigma when people enlist around disclosing mental health issues. Like any job application, they're worried it will cost them the opportunity of the job. This leads them to deny or downplay existing issues. So the question is, how can we mitigate this? And I think this builds off one of yours comment about that we label, we give these labels and then we automatically react to the label. So the thing goes on, would a focus on previous traumatic experiences as opposed to labelling issues help?
Well, probably yes. I don't know what happens when people now enlist, but I assume there's a comprehensive medical evaluation and psychological testing.
And I do think there is that tension with it, that somebody who's just maybe a bit of a loose cannon, that might be considered attractive. And if you're actually using that as a positive criteria, it really increases the obligation of the care. I think when people are discharged, if you've taken someone in knowing and thinking you can benefit from that, then that is a very, very high impost on you to deal with some transition issues once you've exposed them to potential trauma and putting them back into the community. It's a significant tension.
And thanks. We've got another comment here, and this person is now working for a Veterans Affairs agency, and they served for 30 years, and they said they related to you, many of the comments you made, and about the fact that we take these people in as young adults or teenagers, and we use this extended period to turn them into something, and then at the end they get this very short, what commas is transition process. And this person spoke that they feel that they were extremely lucky to fall on their feet, was their words. But they also comment that they see many who struggle for the reasons that you brought up today, and they think that more needs to happen in the transition, and they really appreciated your comments in your presentation today.
Oh, thank you. It's really valuable when we hear that it resonates with people who have actually had the experience of the military, so I really appreciate that. Thank you.
Yeah. We just need it to resonate with government.
Yeah, I feel like that might be a bit harder job. I should say, implied in some of these, we've had no assistance from the military at all. So how this will translate to military, they've been, what's the word? I'm trying to be diplomatic. Actively resisted. So we haven't had any approval from them. So there's no buy-in at this stage. We're hoping that when we've got some results that we can present to them, it will change. But we haven't had any support. The corrections in South Australia have been very helpful. The ADF, no.
We've got another question here, and it actually leads on from just your comment then and a couple of things that you made. Which you spoke about the support of Chris Tilley for your project, and I've had the opportunity to talk to Chris, and I think he's a great young guy, and he's done a fantastic job, and his vision about what he thinks needs to be done is excellent. So the question is we've talked about prisoners today, but we haven't talked about prison officers who themselves, or correction officers who themselves are veterans.
Yes.
So the question is, has there been any consideration to incorporating correction officers who've got a military background into this process to understand, one, what's happening for them? And the second part of the question is about how, as we think about supporting veterans in prison, that they might become part of the support team for the veteran while in prison and in that parole period after they leave the formal correction system. So do you have any comment about that?
Well, the first question, I would say it's a separate study, and if anyone's got any money to fund us to do it, that would be fantastic. The second, yes, it makes huge sense, and the work that Chris Tilley did as both a prison officer and also providing a degree of veteran-to-veteran support to ensure that when the veteran was released from prison, that the support services were there, and it would mitigate the risk of reoffending in that critical 2 to 4 week period. Whether that sort of a program can continue is very much based on the individual state corrections departments, unless there's an overarching federal government policy that supports corrections in each state to do this. And the work that Chris has done has been very much dependent on his management structure and management interest in this, given that the number of veterans is still fairly low compared to other groups within the prison population.
Yeah, I agree. And we're talking mostly about Chris because we've had the most to do with him and he's been so wonderful with us. But Ange Coyle in New Zealand, very similar, ex-army background, and she's working as a corrections officer and working with programs. They are uniquely placed. I would almost go so far as to say only they can really do the work that needs to be done in prisons, because they have that relatability, have the institutional knowledge, they have the experiential knowledge, and if they get the proper institutional support, it would be the most profoundly impactful way, I think. But that's one of the things that Chris Tilley said when we first met him. He came back, he went into corrections, and he thought he would see his ex-army colleagues on his side of the corrections thing, and then he's seeing them as prisoners and going, hang on, that they should be working here, not being prisoners. So it is a really interesting point.
And do you think, again, from just your limited exposure, and you mentioned that the value they bring in terms of relatability, But do you think also many of the life skills and the training that they've had in the military is useful? And I don't mean in the enforcement side, but about empathy and understanding of the situation and of the prison population. Is that a value add, do you think, that they bring as well?
Yeah, I definitely
Absolutely.
think hugely important.
We've that earlier question where it was had the three parts in it, the person's come back and said, sorry for the long-winded question before. I work for Corrections New Zealand, and what he raised was that they spent some effort about looking at having teams to work with offenders to transition out of the prison system. And the suggestion was perhaps it's something that in Australia and elsewhere might be something to be considered and built into the system. I think that is, from the way that's written, also suggests that that be actively supported by people like Veterans Affairs and the Defence Forces.
We're talking about veterans today, but everything we say about the support and the peer and the relatability, that could be applied to practically every group that's in the prison system. You know, there's some, you know, just unrecalcitrant kind of people who want to commit crimes in prison. Many of them are from particular groups who we know are particularly vulnerable, and if they had some more support to transition, it could help an enormous number of people as well as veterans.
Mm-hmm. That raises a point you did mention in your presentation, for example, about those veterans in prison who had mental health conditions, that when they go into the prison, they lose access to DVA services that would be available if they were outside. Is that something that we need to be thinking about in various countries, about that people, or this population anyway, not being cut off from accessing services that would be available to them if they were outside? And I appreciate that might be a bit more challenging in the prison context, but is that something that needs to be thought about?
Definitely. It's an issue, and it's certainly been raised by members of the veteran community in this state in relation to, you know, treatment being provided while people are in prison. You know, we have a large counselling service available for veterans plus private providers, and it just seems that it's too big a hurdle at the moment for the Department of Veterans Affairs to get over. But when we're talking about people who have need for specialised counselling, you know, how do you train the limited counsellors within the correction system to understand and respond to the mental health needs that come up, you know, from your military experience? It's yeah. Or is it better to somehow look at ways of bringing the specialised services into the prison system, which we certainly think is the better way to go?
Well, that raises a very interesting aspect about, is there a place, again, based on what you've seen and that comment, that our veterans agencies in particular maybe need to be working more closely with agencies such as corrections, to be looking at what supports that corrections or similar agencies need to better support veterans, given that one of the charters of Veterans Affairs is to support veterans regardless of where they are in the community.
Yes.
So is that something that we need to be thinking about, is how we build relationships and get some of those things happening? Would that be an important thing from what you've seen?
Yeah, the interagency cooperation, and Chris Tilley, again, he's been such a useful link because he's now on, I'm not sure the name, Elaine, the Veterans Advisory Committee, something like that?
Yes, for the state.
So he's on that, so he goes and talks to a lot of people, so he is a really valuable kind of triangulation link between corrections, military experience and Veterans Affairs. So having key people like that who are great communicators, and have got the experience and got the connection and got the institutional kind of placement, really, really important. If you think of South Australia, I mean, we had 93 people identified. It's not a huge number of people. And probably the only good thing about prisons is that you've got people in one place. You've got access to them. So some of these guys are doing quite a significant period of time in prison. While they're there, and prisoners are mostly really bored, so that's a good time to get people to comply with things. So you've got access to them, and they've got a lot of time, not a lot of distractions. You could work with 93 people individually, and it's a shame that it has to wait till they're in prison. Obviously, it'd be better to have it before they're in prison, but once they're in, you've got the powers of compulsion, you've got the location, and you don't have huge numbers of people. So surely they could all be case managed.
We've got another comment and then a question, and the comment is, this person thinks that we need to frame any recommendations in this area in terms that are helpful to the military as might be for the veterans. Given what you've learnt from the veterans that you interviewed, can you see an upside for the military in identifying those at risk for this trajectory early and intervening soon after they're recruited? And you did, I think, talk about something along those lines. And, and the second part, I'll just mention them. And might they become more effective in the military by virtue of the qualities that you've identified if those propensities were shaped and harnessed by the military for the nation's advantage?
Yeah, look, I think the good thing, I mean, it surprised me in a sense how well the military comes out of this. People like being there. They felt generally supported, valued while they were there. So to present that to the military, they wouldn't necessarily get as defensive as they might with just the bad. We're saying when you've got them there, it actually works really well. All you need to work with is when you let them out. And I can see from an institutional point of view, it's much less motivating to work with people productively when they're leaving than when they're in. But I think, yes, some identification of the issues while they're in. And some of these guys, they wouldn't have taken that much to keep them in, especially the ones that were medically discharged. So maybe a bit more case management within, and you wouldn't have them leaving and wouldn't have those transition issues to start with. But yes, I think it's a changed mindset. Just because you're leaving us, you're no longer our responsibility. It's not that kind of institution.
I guess having looked at this, and I know that you both said to me that you want to do more work in this area because you think we've only just hardly even scratched the surface. And Christine Haddo, who's going to talk next week, I think you know Christine from Scotland, said something similar, that we've just scratched the surface with this. Because when you look at the folks who are in prison, we haven't looked at those who are on correctional orders and other things where they're not incarcerated, but they're still subject to court orders and other things, parole and the like. So quite clearly, we got more than, in your case, 93 in South Australia. So I guess to summarise, what do you think are the key takeaways out of the study? And then what do you think we should be thinking about doing to respond? And it is okay for you to say some more research, but what other things do you think that we should be thinking about to actually address some of these things, or to start to act in response to them?
I would say that once people have been in the military, they feel like that is defining for their life experience, and everything that happens after is still shaped by their experience in the military. I think the military has to take that on board and say, okay, then our responsibility to you and to the community through you extends well, but beyond the time you leave as well, and think about those preparation, psychological preps, peer mentoring, ceremonial attachments, somehow to keep people engaged well after they leave the military, if they want to. Obviously, some people want to leave and that's it. But I think we need to look at people as military long after they actually formally leave the service.
Elaine?
I would agree with that. And I would also have to say that the role of government does not stop when someone goes into prison.
Yeah.
In terms of recognition that someone has served.
Yeah, no, totally agree.
And it was interesting, your comment about the prime reasons for people being incarcerated, and talking with Ange and others in New Zealand, and Christine and some others in the UK, that seems to be fairly consistent, which are really around what I would call violence-related activities, essentially. And I think, I don't want to misquote our New Zealand colleagues, but I'm pretty sure the comment is that when they looked at it, the reasons for incarceration were different because they were clustered around those things as opposed to the general population. So in other words, there seem to be those common themes in there. So despite the numbers appearing not to be large, the impact, I suspect, of those individuals when they come out of prison on others in their intimate circle is very important. Given your comments about when you looked at it was their intimate circle that influenced them and has led them on that pathway. So what things do you think when they do come out that it actually helps to break that cycle or change that cycle we might need to, that we should be thinking about?
Social connection, purpose, discipline. Because I mean, from what we understand, you say coming out of prison or coming out of the military?
Coming out of prison, yeah.
Coming out of prison, absolutely. That they need, from the interviews, certainly a sense of purpose, preferably a job, but if not a job, some form of engagement. I mean, needing to be occupied, needing to know what you're going to be doing every day and having a structure to your day, and rebuilding relationships if possible with close family members. I mean, that was an area where we saw that these men had all lost their intimate relationships and also the connections with children, and in some cases children through different relationships as well. There was a lot of regret attached to that. So some of the work that had been done in South Australia by the veteran community was helping these men find a sense of place and purpose immediately in those critical weeks after release.
So that's the key, is about that place, sense of place, and sense of identity and sense of acceptance. I guess to summarise what you said.
Yeah. I mean, one participant, having a home to go to. You know, the most obvious thing when you're released, having somewhere to go, having a roof over your head.
Yeah.
And at the moment in South Australia, that seems to be organised by the veteran community itself for veterans who are in prison.
Well, there are many more questions that I would like to ask you. I'm sure others would as well. But I want to say thank you very much for a very thoughtful presentation that's raised or put on the front foot many issues that maybe we all knew but really weren't in the forefront of our mind. And as I said, helping us to join the dots on some of these things, again, with the work of others on other aspects of veterans' lives. I think very helpful for us to think about this subpopulation. So often we get subsumed, as you said, by the big ticket items like suicide, but we forget that there are other areas of behaviour that I would fit under the thing of aberrant or self-destructive that actually are also very important for us to understand and respond to. And that we shouldn't lose sight of them or have them get lost by looking at the bigger things that trump over the top. Because the ripples of, as you quite rightly spoke about, of these folks being in the correctional system and the impact of that when they come out on their family relationships and others, then triggers, you know, further ripples and down the track. So thank you very much for your time today, for your sharing your generosity and sharing your insights, and we really appreciate it and look forward to having you perhaps participate in further discussions as we look at this group going forward. And thank you. And thank you to all of you who joined us today. Really appreciated you joining us. Hope you found that useful. Look forward to having you join us next week when we hear from Dr. Christine Haddo from Scotland, who will add some, reinforce some of the messages we've heard today, but also will actually bring in some other perspectives that they're seeing in Scotland. And again, raising more questions about challenging us about how we think about them and how we respond to them. So thank you, everyone. Hope you have a wonderful rest of the day, and we look forward to having you join us when next we convene. And thanks, Elaine. Thanks, Kelly.
Thank you very much for the opportunity, and thanks for tuning in. Okay, thanks a lot. Bye.
Thank you.